Emancipate yourself from mental slavery.
None but ourselves can free our minds.
Okay, Land of the Giants, Les Miserables Part 2. And back to the cult book, the very treacherous book that turns you into the Victor Hugo cult member, which is the greatest book ever written.
The prescription for all virtue going forward.
So I want to go over the whole plot really quick in this episode, like quick. But I guess if we don't get through it, that's fine. I think we should just stop at part two, no matter where we get. but Les Miserables begins with Jean Valjean, and he meets a bishop. He's just got out of jail, and he meets a bishop, and the bishop is kind to him, unlike everybody else, but he steals the bishop's silverware. Um, and when he is caught, the bishop says, "I gave you the candlesticks as well." So there you go, because he figures out that that was the story that he was trying to tell the police. He was trying to tell them that he gave it to him. Um, so the bishop is very nice, and this makes Jean Valjean turn into the perfect cult member for the rest of the book.
Right. Okay. Fair play. Do you want to elucidate a little more? I'm not going to put words in your mouth. You want to give a description of what that cult is?
Well, I think we talked about it in part one. So I think, well, why don't you say what you think is happening in this sequence?
Well, I mean, I think that as I had referenced in our first part, Hugo spectacularly and notably held on to his Catholicism and his framework throughout his sort of, let's call it, transformative experience in his midlife towards the end of his life, where he becomes increasingly committed to radical Republican forms, which, Les Mis is an entire Bible. I think if you sit it alongside of Marx and Engels, you've got pretty much most of the cogent critiques of ancien regime and really exploitative first stage capitalism and so on and so forth. So I think that what he's doing there is trying to demonstrate the kind of ancient Christian idea that good works are really what reflects the kind of Christ message, and that those are the things that will signify saintliness and virtue and goodness. And so, much like a kind of communion exercise, I think that the being on the receiving end of grace and forgiveness and all of the things that are held to be the core message of what Christianity is trying to gift to the world. I think that's Hugo basically saying, look, here we have our main character who is a sinner, who has now been redeemed by a Christ-like act of grace and forgiveness. And off he goes being the Christ throughout the rest of this book.
Well, yeah, sure. And this is obviously based on, turn the other cheek, or give him your cloak, because that's what the bishop does. Yeah. And when Jean experiences this, he comes to face himself, because he is contrasted with the selflessness of the bishop, and after that he decides to be the selfless man, and that's kind of who he is for the rest of the story.
Yeah, and I mean, for all of my wah, it's really a basic exercise of, if you show somebody how to be good, then they know how to be good.
Sure, yeah. And so then he escapes his parole, so the police don't know where he is. He's supposed to be tracked everywhere he goes, but he escapes, and he becomes a wealthy citizen with a factory. and he makes lots of money, and he treats the workers nice. Um, and there is this scene in well, I watched it in the musical, and it's so ridiculous where he is like lifting up this carriage that fell on a man
Hmm.
and rescuing him, and he's the only one strong enough to lift the carriage. And this is the moment when Javert recognizes him, and he says, "He is a criminal. He only the criminal could be that strong." And I'm just like, how can you even write this? Like, it is so absurd. Like, it just seems like something, like he's right there, like saving somebody. He's like rescuing a man from being run over, and the policeman can only see that he is a criminal.
It's so interesting. I'm listening to you talk, and I'm thinking about how that calls to mind, the figure of Samson, who is also, beloved by God, but put into a position of being, effectively treated like a criminal, and all of those kinds of things. But at the same time, I'm wondering to myself, I wonder really, because neither you nor I are walking around in Paris in either 1840 or 1870, in London when Hugo wrote this in the 70s. I mean, I wonder to myself whether or not people actually spoke like this. It's an interesting speculation to think about whether or not the literary forms of stuff that we have, reported speech, in written form, actually reflects the way in which people truly spoke to each other.
Well, I'm sure they didn't, but
I
my
don't
my
know.
point is that this seems
I
like a
don't know.
scene.
I don't know. I think as I listen to you quote, right, um, I'm thinking about the fact that although this was published in print form, it's still absolutely coming out in a period of time where um, a lot of stuff, Dickens, Hugo, everybody serialized everybody. People were still receiving a lot of the written word through others reading it out loud. And while people might not have spoken to each other in the street like that, that is very sermon like. And we are talking about a period of time where all people are being exposed all the time to sermon like, religious like declarations and speech. So while I agree, it's a very forced kind of Ayn Randian type of declaration, on Javert's part, I'm not sure that it is as far from the way in which people perhaps like spoke to each other, as
Anyway,
it
well,
sounds now.
my point is just that this book has scenes that should be out of a comedy. That they seem like they are so absurd that they should be in a comedy, but it's just like that man rescuing somebody else, from certain death. He's a criminal,
No, it's interesting because it is making me think about Rand, and it is making me think about Dickens even, and it is making me think about what happens when novels are more vehicles for whether it's straightforward philosophy or it's an attempt to rouse social change that might otherwise be seen in kind of political speeches or an attempt to educate. Um, it's an interesting thing that happens to the art form. So anybody who can pull off both at the same time without moving into passages where precisely the effect is essentially comic because we got it already. So why is it either melodramatic or going on or being, presented in very kind of heroic terms? Um, it's an interesting kind of comment on how we hear it.
Well, this is kind of like where one of the things that I'm just like stupid or genius because like I think Victor Hugo's characters are excellent archetypes, and
Because
it's the things that they do are kind of silly, but they are such evocative ways of depicting the archetypes. So so a part of me wants to laugh, and part of me is really very interested in it.
I think
So I'm
you're.
gonna
I think yeah. Go ahead.
I was
I
just to
wanted
say
to.
I'm going to skip Fontaine now because I want to get to Cosette and Thénardier.
No, I think you're right to do that, and I was just going to reflect on what I'd said earlier in the first episode about the narrative that's pulled out and shown in the musical as a hieroglyph. I personally recently have been thinking about how myths evolve, and I'm of the opinion that the myths are the stories that that describe the hieroglyphs. Um, and so myths are by definition, I mean, the ones that we're most familiar with generally in the West are the Greco-Roman ones. And if you think about some of those, they're also quite hilarious. Or I don't know. I mean, I read a lot of children's books, so I have versions of Hercules in reported speech, and yeah, some of that is ridiculous. Okay, but at the same time, it's precisely because they are archetypes that they have such resonance. So you can kind of see human beings doing the same thing over and over again, which is taking abstract knowledge and coding it into what are essentially symbols. And myths are, I think, the most contracted form of verbal symbols. And they're kind of like an exposes, can't remember the word, but they're an expository on what are hieroglyphs.
Yeah, absolutely. No, totally agree. And remember, last time I was saying that I think Les Miserables could be like the Mahabharata. It could be like the
Precisely.
foundational book of a whole society, and that's kind of what the archetypical characters accomplish. So
I think that's
eventually, Jean Valjean has to run away, and he agrees to take care of Fontaine's child Cosette, and this is another selfless act on his part. He never gets anything for himself in the book, uh, and but he ends up rescuing Cosette, who's sort of mistreated by the Thénardiers. They're someone who was taking care of her while Fontaine, the real mother, it was working in Jean Valjean's factory, and what I think is interesting about Thénardier, just to start out, Thénardier is kind of like the trickster character. He's kind of like Loki, and
mm-hmm,
he's very very sinister in this book,
mm-hmm,
and I think he represents capitalism in a lot of
mm-hmm.
ways. But
It makes
I
him
also
an
oh
artful
well,
dodger, but
I was just say, but I also think that he is almost so similar to Jean Valjean, and he does the same kinds of things throughout the book. Like he makes a bunch of money at one point, and he escapes from prison, and he does the same kind of thing, and he's also somebody who comes out of the lower classes. So to me, Thénardier and Jean together form a complete character, and it is almost like they go together so well to me that part of me is thinking Victor Hugo is just so dumb and his mind is just fragmented that he just doesn't notice that he does that, and another part of me is like, this is so genius that he did this, and now you notice that that is the complete person. But I'm not sure that that's really that's really what the message is.
I would have to say I argue for the second. I argue for a degree of consciousness that Hugo brought to this work. It was, more or less his last work, and this was a guy who knew what he was doing. And I think that the Thénardier character and Jean clearly are a Christ and devil pairing. I think that on a secular level, he's very explicitly making the case that capitalism and class and background, and even right down to desires, motivations, goals, and so on, that all the difference rests in the character of the person who is practicing the capitalism. So the very fact that Jean is a self-sacrificing, enlightened, almost kind of cryptocurrency type of industry boss, doing a form of capitalism that spreads good, not evil, is precisely Hugo's critique on the forces that operate on mankind and mankind's capacity to choose how to navigate those forces.
Oh, okay. Well, good. Well, that if that was a deliberate decision, that makes me think better of Victor Hugo, and maybe he's not quite as bad a narcissist as I was thinking.
Well, I would argue he's totally, I think at 1900 pages, he's full on narcissist. I mean, I would argue that it can simultaneously be true. That, as we pointed out in the first one, not only did he want everybody to think he was the greatest novelist of all time, but that he was the greatest thinker of all time.
Sure, but what
you know,
I'm saying is narcissism comes with like this really amazing like unself-consciousness. You
right.
know what I'm saying? So I would say that a narcissist would be a kind of person who would invent good and evil versions of the same character and put them together in a novel and not notice that they go together.
Yeah, I think I mean I totally agree with you about narcissism being so self-absorbed as to have no kind of meta consciousness. I mean, I think my take on that would be that I think if you walked up to Hugo today and said, "Do you realize that you were trying to start a religion?" He would say, "Of course I wasn't. I was giving you the truth." You know.
Right, yeah.
So I think to a certain extent, anybody who's out there declaring that they have an exclusive insight into the truth and that's it is profoundly narcissistic. Okay, because they can't really imagine how other people might think about what's true. So that
Absolutely, yes.
go on like Hugo. I mean, God, can you imagine sitting around at a dinner table with one of those 19th century giants? I mean, you couldn't get in. Neither one of us would have been able to get a word in edgewise.
Right. So let's see.
So, I mean, I have a question for you, right? Because I think you're right. I think narratively, Jean does not get anything, right? Throughout, it's continually giving to others. So, but I wonder what Hugo would say to that. I wonder if you have a sense of like, what do you think Hugo thinks that Jean is getting, right? Um, like what is the, because I'm not sure he ever really comes out and says, well, Jean's, got a great place in heaven and he has salvation. But maybe he is. Maybe that is what's going on.
Well, if that's what's going on, then to me that's not much of a message. But yeah, last time remember I said I think Jean is like what the narcissist would think about himself, like
Right.
somebody who
Right.
is looking for um, redemption at the end when everybody finally recognizes that he is the source of all goodness,
Right.
and Jean is like someone who does good things for his entire life, and nobody really notices.
Yeah.
So Thénardier has a daughter named Eponine, who she's kind of cut down a little bit in the musical, and I think that she has a kind of a similar like duality with Cosette
Mm-hmm.
in the novel, because Cosette is kind of like she's kind of like the sweet girl. That's her personality,
Mm-hmm.
and she doesn't do anything. And Eponine is kind of somebody who is out in the streets, who isn't being protected in a middle class garden, and
Yep.
so um, later they introduce Marius, and he is the young man character, and this is kind of like this is like that's his character. That's it. That's who he is, and he's another archetype.
I was
And
about
yeah,
to say
this
it is archetypal, right? I mean, it is yeah, it's highly archetypal.
right, and yeah, and this is the kind of thing where like I feel like Victor Hugo, you've made such a silly character here, but then like everything he does is just the perfect young man archetype.
Right.
So first he falls in love with Cosette and he starts stalking her even though he doesn't know what her name is. And and she falls in love too. She doesn't know him at all either. They don't even get to talk in the book, I think. They kind of make it in the musical that they get to talk to each other a lot more.
No, it would make a lot of. I mean, let's put it this way: it makes a lot more sense that they really don't get to talk because just there, I mean, the echoes you can sort of feel where Hugo is absolutely picking up his sources, right? Because he's echoing his authority by to whatever kind of obvious level echoing his heritage, the great Western canon, right? So both Dante and Petrarch have, you know, beloved love objects that they never speak to, but that the power of that interaction has all of these consequences. So the idea of the beloved that is unspoken to is, you know, a rich and deep vein in what Hugo will have read himself, right? What he will have considered to be the great um, works. And then the other thing I just wanted to jump in and say, because it never had occurred to me, is of course Carl Jung would have read Hugo, right? And you know, it's resonant because we are using the language and the insights of archetypes and so on in ways that definitely derive from his works, and then 20th century works on top of those. And yeah, that's just kind of cool because I had never really thought about the fact that Jung's own thought may well have come from reading more modern type, because Hugo would have been very modern to him, right? Modern types of myth stories. So it's a that's just an interesting thing. Sorry to jump in there, but yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, like Thénardier is like the shadow version of Jean Valjean. Um, so Marius falls in love with Cosette. Oh, and Jean is just psychotic about protecting Cosette from him. So they kind of gloss over this mostly in the musical too, where he is trying to like manipulate everything so that they never even get to see each other again. And he's like, we have to move away now for no reason.
Right. And just to make a small point here about an obvious other kind of mirror shadow duality presentation of the, you know, ancient, to me, it's like the great rift in kind of human history is when the female persona becomes split into the Madonna, the whore, the protected, walled off middle class flower, and the lower class or to be suspect, you know, experienced person on the street. I mean, I think for sure that is something that, you know, is in the culture and in the water that Hugo is drinking and living. And I also think that it's an interesting meditation, you know, on what he thinks about that, because clearly by drawing attention to it, he's of his time, right? This is the beginning of the suffragette movement. There's growing kind of gathering awareness about, certainly in England at the time, about how badly the prostitution laws were unnecessarily penalizing women. I mean, there's all of this stuff in the air, and yet at the same time, you can see the tension in the way in which his archetypal characters react, right? Precisely around the kind of thing that you are describing, no?
Oh yeah, so yeah, that actually reminds me of something that I wanted to mention earlier. Because to me, like Thénardier and Éponine are like lower class stereotypes, and they're pretty nasty stereotypes. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is another weird. Well, it's just this kind of thing where he's trying to be like the high-minded, truth teller, and
Mm-hmm.
then he's like, well, now I'll create some bad characters for my heroes to react against, and then then he doesn't maybe he doesn't notice that it's kind of like revealing his own prejudices, his own
Very good. Very good.
his
Right.
own uh nasty thoughts about the lower classes.
Well, his bias. I mean, his bias, right? So it's the tension in like trying to create realism, create realistic art in order to tell some truth. This is the great modernism with a capital M that postmodernism is trying so hard to push against. It's the precisely the idea that you can declare truth, um, but if you don't acknowledge your own biases, then your truth is always going to be problematic because sooner or later, someone like you is going to come along and point out that this true portrait of the lower class that you've given is, in fact, the stereotypical reflection of your own class.
Sure. And not that lower class people are that great, but well,
All
I
all
should say
people
like there's some things that Thenardier does that are very hard to dismiss too. And that's what makes him a great archetype. Like there's a part where he has a class system in his household with the children. So Cosette is kind of like the lower class child in the household, and this is kind of, and the two daughters that are his biologically, they're like the upper class children in the household. And
Hello,
then the
Cinderella.
situation the
Hello,
situation
Cinderella.
what
I said, hello, Cinderella.
right, yeah, and then the situation is reversed when they get out. Yeah, oh yeah, clearly that's a Cinderella thing, but also like just the there's definitely I don't know, like to me this seems like a very like it is a stereotype, but it also seems like something that's hard for me to dismiss as well, you know.
Yeah, and that's the nature of archetypes is that they encode what are undeniable truths, um, and so I think there is some real insight there. And I think, I mean, this is such an obvious and trite thing to say, but you know, being an asshole or being an angel, it's an equal opportunity lottery, right? I do not think that class education or any other variable accounts for it. So that's just a side point. I think that um, the parallels with the Artful Dodger in Oliver Twist and some of those kinds of um, powerful narrative insights, because they are true about reversal of fortune when you change context,
Yeah.
are stuff that Hugo, whether or not he's conscious of it or not, every artist is in whatever manner quoting tissues of other influences.
Well,
So
and now that you think of it, that's kind of how I feel about getting into Bitcoin, because
right.
like outside of Bitcoin, it feels like I'm like a complete nobody who is totally incompetent to do normal things, but inside Bitcoin is like perfectly adapted to me.
No, I mean, I have to say I feel the same way because I have such a sort of a polymath cluster of interests, right? From like science and math to history to law to activism to writing. I mean, and it is difficult because um, they don't advertise spaces like this as having 9 to 5 jobs, and so to find a space in which I can start to think about how to craft doing the stuff that I've always liked to do, which is to read and write and teach and talk, but in a subject space that somehow manages to combine all of these disciplines that previously were so siloed off from each other. I think the bridge that opens between the humanities and the science, between software and symbols, how to talk hieroglyphics to coders. It's really it's an awesome kind of shift of context. But yeah, I feel you.
Okay, well, back to the book.
Yeah, back to the book.
So Eponine falls in love with Marius,
Mhm.
but he doesn't notice, and he thinks that she's just a beggar. So he tries to give her money, and she gets angry at him about that.
Right, which is kind of coded for prostitution, but yeah. Hmm.
Right, yes. So then somehow she ends up with a letter from Cosette. So she deliberately she's supposed to be delivering the message, but she deliberately interferes, like she doesn't give it to him soon enough. And Marius is feeling suicidal because he doesn't get to see Cosette anymore, or something. So he decides to join the revolutionaries. So I think that there's, well, and there's, oh, and I should say, watching the musical again, I just love the leader of the revolutionaries, because
Yeah.
he is like the perfect cult leader character.
Oh, he's wonderful. Like who did Che Guevara, model himself on? And it just, what you just said made me wonder, just how many boys from the West end up on the ISIS team because some girl broke their heart,
Yeah.
Um,
So, but there's a part in the musical where he's just like, "Our little lives don't count at all." Sorry, I can't do it very well, but anyway, he sings like
I'm
that,
not the,
and
you sing first
he he says, "Your lives don't count,"
at all.
and right, yes, and I kind of think that like part of the reason he's the revolutionary leader is everybody recognizes that he's the most suicidal of anybody, so they're just like, we'll just let him be the leader.
But think about it. Think about who the archetypal first one up over the trenches was, right? It
Right,
is.
yeah.
I mean, to a certain extent, going and then go back to the Greeks. I mean, that's a really great insight. Is that how much of bravery and heroism is effectively suicidal in the sense of not caring as opposed to actively seeking, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So Eponine draws Marius into the battle, into the revolution behind the barricades, but then she ends up getting shot for him. Like she stands in front of him to get shot
Mm.
instead of him.
Mm.
And he kind of like completely forgets that she exists because he finds the note from Cosette on her. And it's it's like the novel also completely forgets about Eponine at this point too. It's just like, well, she's gone. And
Yeah,
to
and
me,
also she served my narrative. She served my narrative purpose, right? I mean, that's the other thing is that I don't think Hugo is particularly skilled at um, hiding the operations of narrative plot device, right?
that is a real understatement there, right? But yeah, that's another thing that almost
No
seems like
disrespect, but he's a little bit like Dan Brown of the, he's got some
noted
points, but it's
noted novelist Dan Brown.
yeah. Well, I mean, I definitely, but I definitely think that that's the case. Is like if you are trying to produce a work that is going to reach a super wide audience, it can be very difficult to not end up just signposting, right, and page turning your people along because not everybody is as interested in the like deep core, heavy duty meanings that you are, right?
Okay, so I have to ask you, have you ever seen the movie The Room?
No, you have told me about the room, but I
Okay, because to me, this thing here, this is like stupid or genius. Like what I was just saying about how the novel just completely forgets that Eponine exists. Like that seems like very suggestive to me. Like there could be some kind of hidden message there. But yeah, I really think that Victor Hugo was just so focused on creating tear-jerking scenes that he just wasn't worrying about how it all fit together that much. And that's kind of like the movie The Room, which is also clearly made by a narcissist. And The Room is kind of like this too, where if you watch it for a few seconds, it actually kind of draws you in, and it has interactions that seem dramatic. But if you watch for longer than that, you're just like there are some really weird things going on in this movie.
Great. The thing I will say, the thing I will say about getting forgotten, right, is that you could, if you were gonna do like at a stretch, you could make some comment about it being a kind of symbolic just punishment, okay, for her interference. So instead of being the one who is beloved and cherished and remembered, in fact, she is so clearly forgotten. So the novel forgets her, everybody forgets her.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that to a certain extent, again, this may well be moving into the kinds of types of literary criticism that postmodernism takes some licks over, which I think it definitely should be criticized for when it gets extreme, which is trying to read too much of a kind of psychoanalytical gloss into what did Hugo know or think, or what was he thinking when he wrote it, because to a certain extent, that's where some of the insights of a kind of modernist approach, kick in again, which is like, look, any piece of art, no matter what the intentions or consciousness of the person who created it, it exists in conversation with people who are reading it, consuming it, watching it, and so on. So at a certain
But
point, it almost doesn't matter what.
but you could also say that this represents the revolution, serving the egos of the people in it rather than the people they are presuming to represent. But to me, that almost seems too intelligent for Victor Hugo.
Although, on the other hand, I think there are a lot of millions of French men, particularly, who would say, oh, but no, that is in our blood because we have been studying how revolutions fail since we first had one, and we keep having them and they keep failing. And the reason why they keep failing is precisely that kind of insight that you just articulated. So however it comes to be expressed, right, whether it's kind of explicit or implicit in the work, it is worth recalling that, the defining arc moment of the man's life and of the book and so on, and was, what do you do in the face of failed revolution?
So, geez, just one other cool thing that I wanted to mention, because I don't really have anything. I don't think the rest of the book is that interesting. Stuff happens. Just go read it. But there's a chapter I was looking through the Spark Notes, and there was a chapter that I thought was really interesting, where Gavroche, he is another child of Thénardier,
Mm-hmm.
and he doesn't he has been on the streets since he was very small, so he doesn't even know that Thénardier is his father. And there's a chapter where he is wandering around town, and he is sort of randomly helping people, being kind of Christ-like, and everybody he helps is actually his family member, but he doesn't know. And this happens several times, and I thought that was like that's just such a Victor Hugo thing to do, because it's like these ridiculous coincidences that don't make any sense and are just so silly. If you were to take them seriously as plot points.
Yeah, but you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of Oedipus Rex in reverse. Okay. So it reminds me of like a family member wandering around having these interactions with people who are his unknown to him family members. But instead of it causing like death, destruction, eye gouging, incest, murder, and so on, it results in all of these positive effects. So that's the kind of model that echoed for me, like in that kind of a context, because it is an unrealistic narrative that is mythological, precisely because it's both unrealistic and so powerful as to sort of transmit some other deeper message, right?
Exactly.
And I am not suggesting that Oedipus Rex and Hugo, right, are trying to transmit the same message at all. But right. There is definitively a message vehicle, right?
So so all of these relationships are just kind of like the relationships of the gods in a pantheon, right? So if Thénardier is like the god of capitalism, just for the sake of argument, because I'm not just saying, perhaps,
one of the gods, right? Capitalism.
Yeah.
Have many gods, and so in a pantheon we got lots of gods for lots of elements. So he's
and he has children. He has Eponine, and he has Gavroche,
Hmm.
And well, it's just kind of like how Dickens in like A Christmas Carol, he says like my children are want and ignorance, and
Hmm.
those are the people who hang around. Who do they hang around? I forgot.
Not off the top of my head. Poverty and
Want and ignorance. That's who they're. These children who are hanging around one of the spirits, I think. Yeah, I think the first spirit.
that's Christmas past.
Yeah. So
Past.
so uh so he's using family relationships. I mean, Victor Hugo is he's using family relationships to represent conceptual relationships, but it ends up with a plot that is just so silly.
It is best put on the stage, right? I mean, to a certain extent, that's I think I think a lot of the kinds of stylistic things that you're picking up on may well be the reason why it is so successful on the stage, because it is actually not realistic, and it is not an exercise in realism. As much as I think Hugo would have said, this is a real reflection of the way things really are. And his use of the kind of sense of really is that truth that drama brings to a subject, right?
So actually, I do want to say something about the conclusion of the novel. So we already talked about Jean versus Javert. So eventually, Javert is confronted with himself the same way that Jean is at the beginning of the book, and Javert kills himself instead of turning around because
Mm-hmm.
he just realized that he just wasted his entire life tracking the least dangerous criminal in history for his entire existence. So then and Jean finally decides that he can give up Cosette, and Marius can be the new protector of Cosette, because he kind of decides to rescue Marius in the behind the barricade, and he finally decides that Marius is okay, and this is kind of like his central conflict for most of the story, is that he his best course, according to Victor Hugo, is to be selfless, but he tries to be possessive of Cosette, and then he finally decides at the end that he can let Marius be possessive of Cosette.
It's an interesting parallel too, right? Because there's some kind of suicide of the self in letting go of the need to possess. Um, it's kind of the actual annihilation of the self, which is kind of mirrored in Chavez' actual suicide, right? Like it's the same kind of confrontation with like actual what virtue means. And so if the laws are not virtuous, can you follow them? And if holding on to Cosette is non-virtuous, can you hold on to her? So it becomes this kind of nihilistic thing at the end. It's all very redemptive, but I think as much as the kind of Christian message of self-sacrifice, or the Ayn Rand message of, the kind of inverse message of like altruism, there's something very clearly self-destroying in self-denial, right?
Yeah. Oh, and you reminded me of something else. I was going to say Jean is like the inverse of uh, John Galt,
Yeah.
because Jean is he's there throughout the novel doing things, and nobody recognizes him, whereas John Galt, everybody knows who he is, but nobody knows what he's doing, and he's not in the novel for most of the novel. It's he's like the inverse, because in Atlas Shrugged, everybody says, who is John Galt, and they don't even know that that's an important question. It's just kind of like something they say that just means, I don't know.
Right. How long is a piece of string? Yeah, no, precisely. And that's a really clearly, right? So it's a good place to kind of draw us back to, I guess, towards the end of this discussion, because um, we mentioned, I'm sure, at the beginning of the first part about the fact that Rand was a huge fan of Hugo. No? And it's an interesting observation that Galt likewise ends up alone without the female character, without the one clear vehicle of his desire and any kind of desire to possess. And so the way in which he gives up Darcy, right, in Atlas Shrugged, is an interesting kind of thing to sit next to John's decision to let go of Cosette, right?
I actually don't remember what you're talking about at all, so I'll have to review. But
But yeah, I mean, I think that the whole kind of not possessing um, is quite intense.
so, well, anyway, great discussion. Do you have anything to conclude with?
Not only that, that anybody who makes it through the whole of that book, truly makes it through the whole of that book, every single page, is a saint. And I can't say that I have, but I'm really glad that I made my way through as much of it as I did. And I would
Oh, okay.
our viewers,
Nice admission.
yeah,
It is the greatest book in history.
in history, and it's a better doorstop than Atlas Shrugged. But yeah, I would encourage people to even do something along the lines of if they're in a bookstore and they find it on the shelf and they have half an hour to literally just open it at random places and experience, because you never know what you're going to come across in that book, is what I have to say.
Absolutely.
So I will see you in the next one.